Mark had been dreaming of this trip for months. Ever since he saw pictures of the Grand Palace with its towering spires and golden gates, he knew he had to visit. The idea of walking through cobblestone streets, surrounded by centuries of history, filled him with excitement. He saved up every penny, booked his flight, and finally landed in the bustling capital city of a European country known for its charm and tradition. But as Mark stepped off the plane, jet-lagged and carrying a heavy backpack, reality began to creep in. The airport was chaotic, crowds everywhere, long lines at immigration, and an endless wait for his luggage. By the time he reached his hotel, fatigue was setting in. Still, he couldn't resist heading out immediately. After all, there were only so many days to see everything on his list. With a map in hand and his camera slung over his shoulder, Mark set off toward the city center, eager to explore. At first, everything seemed magical. Horse-drawn carriages clattered along the streets, street performers entertained passers-by, and cafes overflowed with locals sipping coffee. But soon, small frustrations started adding up. The subway system confused him, and Google Maps kept directing him down narrow alleys that led nowhere. When he finally found the right route, the train was delayed, leaving him standing on a crowded platform for nearly half an hour. By the time Mark arrived at the palace, his mood had soured. His feet hurt from walking miles, his stomach growled because he hadn't eaten lunch yet, and the sun beating down made him sweat under his jacket. To make matters worse, the line to enter the palace stretched around the block. Frustrated, he decided to skip the tour and instead wandered around the grounds, hoping to snap some photos of the iconic royal guards stationed outside. As he approached the main entrance, Mark noticed groups of tourists gathered near the guards. Their bright uniforms stood out against the stone walls of the palace, and people jostled each other trying to get the perfect shot. Cameras flashed, children laughed, and guides spoke loudly, explaining the history of the site. It felt more like a circus than a historic landmark. Mark squeezed through the crowd, growing angrier by the second. He tried to find a good angle for his photo but couldn't seem to get close enough. Every time he moved forward, someone else stepped in front of him. Just when he thought things couldn't get worse, a little boy darted past him, brushing against his leg. Mark stumbled backward, nearly dropping his camera. He muttered something under his breath, glaring at the child's parents, who didn't even notice. That's when it happened. A spark of irritation turned into full-blown rage. Mark looked at the guards standing perfectly still, seemingly oblivious to the chaos around them. What's the point of these guys anyway? He thought bitterly. They just stand there like statues while everyone else struggles. Little did he know, this fleeting moment of resentment would lead to a decision he'd regret forever. As Mark stood there, simmering with frustration, his eyes locked onto one of the royal guards stationed near the palace entrance. The guard's posture was impeccable, chin up, shoulders back, and hands clasped neatly in front of him. His uniform, adorned with polished buttons and a tall hat, seemed almost too perfect against the backdrop of chaos. Tourists swarmed around him, snapping photos, pointing, and laughing. Yet the guard didn't flinch, not even a blink. To Mark, it felt like mockery. He couldn't understand how someone could just stand there, unmoving, as if nothing else mattered. Didn't the guard see how crowded and chaotic it was? Didn't he care that people were struggling to get decent pictures or that kids were running wild? Mark's irritation grew with each passing second. He began to feel invisible, as though no one, not the tourists, not the guards, acknowledged his presence or shared his struggle. It was irrational, but in that moment, all he saw was indifference. The final straw came when another tourist accidentally bumped into him while backing up for a selfie. Mark stumbled again, this time spilling water from the bottle he'd been holding. Drops splashed onto his shirt, and he let out an exasperated groan. "Watch where you're going," he snapped, but the person barely glanced at him before turning back to their camera. No apology, no acknowledgement, just more noise and commotion. Fuming, Mark turned his attention back to the guard. Something about the man's stoic expression infuriated him further. Why should he be the one suffering while this guy got to act so superior? Mark clenched his fists, muttering under his breath, standing there like some kind of statue. What's the big deal about you anyway? His thoughts spiraled. Maybe they weren't real guards at all, just actors paid to pose for photos. Or maybe they enjoyed watching everyone else scramble while they stayed perfectly still. Whatever the reason, Mark convinced himself that the guard deserved to be taught a lesson. A small voice in the back of his mind whispered that this was ridiculous, but anger drowned it out. He needed to do something to release his pent-up frustration. Nearby, a decorative planter caught his eye. It was filled with fine sand, meant to add a touch of elegance to the palace grounds. Without thinking twice, Mark bent down, scooped up a handful of sand, and straightened up. For a brief moment, doubt flickered across his face. Was he really about to do this? But then he remembered how angry he was. The delays, the crowds, the bumping, the guard's unshakable calm. And his resolve hardened. With a deep breath, Mark stepped closer to the guard. His heart raced as adrenaline coursed through his veins. This would show them, wouldn't it? If the guard wanted to play statue, then Mark would give him something to react to. Before anyone could stop him, he hurled the sand directly into the guard's face. The grains hit with surprising force, scattering over the man's cheeks, nose, and eyes. Time seemed to freeze as gasps echoed through the crowd. Cameras lowered mid-shot, children stopped laughing, and even the chatter died down. Everyone stared in stunned silence. For a split second, Mark felt a strange sense of satisfaction. Finally, he'd made someone react. But as reality sank in, his stomach dropped. The guard didn't move. He simply blinked rapidly, trying to clear the sand from his eyes. And then, everything changed. The moment the sand hit the guard's face, a wave of shock rippled through the crowd. People who had been laughing and chatting just seconds earlier fell silent, their expressions shifting from amusement to disbelief. Parents quickly pulled their children closer, shielding them from what might happen next. Cameras that were once focused on capturing picturesque memories now zoomed in on Mark, recording every detail of the unfolding chaos. Mark froze, his hands still hovering in the air, as if he couldn't believe what he'd just done. For a brief second, he thought maybe the guard would brush it off, perhaps laugh, or shake his head like someone amused by a harmless prank. But the guard didn't move. Not even a twitch. His posture remained rigid, his arms still clasped in front of him, as though nothing unusual had occurred. The only sign of discomfort was the slight squint of his eyes as he blinked repeatedly, trying to clear away the sand. At first, Mark felt a flicker of relief. Maybe this wasn't such a big deal after all. Sure, throwing sand at a royal guard wasn't exactly polite, but these guys were trained not to react, right? They probably dealt with worse things than this all the time. He even considered walking away quietly before anyone noticed who'd done it. But then, reality began to set in. Within moments, the other guards stationed nearby sprang into action. Two of them stepped forward, their boots clicking sharply against the pavement as they moved with precision. Their faces were stern, devoid of emotion, but their body language spoke volumes. They meant business. One of them approached the affected guard, gently guiding him aside while speaking softly into a radio attached to his uniform. Another swept the area around them, scanning the crowd for any further disturbances. Meanwhile, the remaining guards turned their attention to Mark. There was no mistaking who the culprit was. He stood out like a sore thumb amidst the sea of horrified tourists. "Sir," one of the guards said firmly, his voice cutting through the tense silence. "Please step back." Mark hesitated, his mind racing. He wanted to explain himself, to say it was just a joke gone wrong, but the words stuck in his throat. Instead, he took a hesitant step backward, glancing around at the dozens of eyes now fixed on him. Some people looked angry, others shocked, and a few even seemed disgusted. A woman muttered something under her breath about disrespecting tradition, while a man shook his head and whispered to his companion, "What an idiot." As the guards closed in, Mark realized there was no escape. His heart pounded in his chest, and his palms grew clammy. This wasn't how his day was supposed to go. He'd come here to enjoy himself, to take photos and soak up the beauty of the palace, not to end up surrounded by armed guards because of some impulsive act. Panic started to creep in as he tried to calculate his next move. Should he apologize? Run? Pretend he hadn't done anything? Before he could decide, the situation escalated. More guards arrived, forming a tight circle around him. One of them placed a firm hand on his shoulder, ensuring he wouldn't try to flee. "You will come with us," another said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Mark nodded weakly, feeling like a cornered animal. As they led him away from the scene, he caught glimpses of tourists filming the entire ordeal on their phones. The humiliation burned hotter than his initial anger. Behind him, the crowd began to murmur again, speculating about what would happen next. Would he be arrested? Fined? Banished from the country? Mark didn't know the answers, but one thing was certain. His reckless decision had consequences far greater than he'd ever imagined. As the guards escorted Mark away from the palace grounds, the weight of his actions began to sink in. His initial defiance melted into a mix of fear and regret as he realized the gravity of what he'd done. The once bustling courtyard now felt eerily quiet, save for the murmurs of onlookers and the rhythmic clinking of metals on the guards' uniforms as they marched him toward a nearby security post. Each step seemed heavier than the last, and Mark couldn't shake the feeling that all eyes were still on him. Once inside the small, sterile room designated for handling incidents, Mark was instructed to sit at a plain metal table. The cool surface pressed against his palms as he tried to steady his breathing. Two guards stood by the door, their expressions unreadable but undeniably intimidating. One of them held a clipboard, jotting down notes while occasionally glancing at Mark with a look that bordered between curiosity and disapproval. For the first time, Mark noticed how tall and imposing they were up close. Their uniforms seemed even more polished, their presence commanding respect. Minutes later, local police officers arrived, adding another layer of seriousness to the situation. They introduced themselves formally before sitting across from Mark, their demeanor calm yet authoritative. "Can you explain what happened out there?" one officer asked, placing a voice recorder on the table between them. Mark swallowed hard, his throat dry. He wanted to speak, to defend himself, but the words caught in his mouth. How could he possibly justify throwing sand at a royal guard? I don't know, he stammered finally, avoiding eye contact. It was stupid. I wasn't thinking. The officers exchanged glances but didn't interrupt. Encouraged by their silence, Mark continued haltingly, trying to piece together an explanation. He talked about his frustration with the crowds, the heat, and the chaos outside. He admitted he'd been angry when the child bumped into him, and that seeing the guard standing so still had made him feel like lashing out. "I thought it would be funny," he said quietly, his voice tinged with shame. "Like maybe he'd react or something. I didn't mean to hurt anyone." His confession did little to ease the tension in the room. One of the officers leaned forward, his tone firm but measured. "Do you understand who those guards represent? They're not just individuals. They symbolize our nation's history, discipline, and pride. What you did isn't just disrespectful. It's considered an offense against the state." Mark's stomach churned as the reality of his actions hit him full force. Assaulting a member of the Royal Guard wasn't just some minor prank. It was a serious crime with real consequences. Witnesses were already being interviewed outside, recounting how they'd seen Mark scoop up the sand and throw it deliberately. Video footage captured by tourists was being reviewed, showing the incident from multiple angles. There was no denying what he'd done. As the interrogation continued, Mark learned that the affected guard had been temporarily blinded by the sand and was being treated for irritation in his eyes. Thankfully, there was no permanent damage, but the fact that he'd caused harm, even unintentionally, weighed heavily on Mark's conscience. "I'm sorry," he repeated over and over, though the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. "I didn't mean for this to happen." Despite his apologies, the officers informed him that the matter wouldn't end here. Formal charges would be filed, and he'd likely face legal repercussions. Until then, he'd remain in custody pending further investigation. When they finally stood to leave the room, Mark felt utterly defeated. Alone at the table, he rested his head in his hands, overwhelmed by guilt and regret. This trip, which had started with so much excitement, had spiraled into a nightmare, and he had no one to blame but himself. The hours that followed were a blur for Mark. After the initial interrogation, he was led to a holding cell at the local police station, a small, dimly lit room with concrete walls and a single metal bench bolted to the floor. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant mixed with dampness, and the only sounds were the distant hum of fluorescent lights and the occasional clink of keys as officers moved through the hallways. For someone who had always prided himself on being independent and self-reliant, this sudden loss of freedom felt suffocating. Sitting alone in the cold, sterile space, Mark's mind raced. He replayed the events of the day over and over again, each memory amplifying his shame. How could he have let his temper get the better of him? What had possessed him to throw sand at a royal guard? It wasn't just an impulsive act. It was reckless, disrespectful, and completely out of character. Back home, Mark considered himself level-headed, someone who rarely lost control. But here he was, behind bars, facing charges that could ruin his life. As time dragged on, reality began to settle in. A lawyer arrived to speak with him, explaining the legal process and outlining the potential consequences of his actions. Assaulting a member of the Royal Guard wasn't treated lightly in this country. It carried significant penalties, including hefty fines and possible jail time. "This is serious," the lawyer warned, his tone grave. "People see the guards as protectors of national pride. What you did isn't just seen as an attack on one person. It's viewed as an insult to the entire nation." Mark listened intently, nodding occasionally, but mostly staring blankly at the floor. His chest tightened as the lawyer continued, detailing how the incident had already made headlines online. Social media platforms were ablaze with reactions, ranging from outrage to mockery. Videos of the moment he threw the sand had gone viral, accompanied by captions calling him everything from reckless to ignorant. Some commenters defended him, arguing that he might not have understood the cultural significance of the guards, while others demanded justice, labeling his behavior as unacceptable. The lawyer advised Mark to prepare for public scrutiny. "You'll need to show genuine remorse if you want any chance of leniency," he said firmly. "Judges often consider intent and attitude when deciding sentences. If you can demonstrate that you regret your actions and understand why they were wrong, it might help." Though overwhelmed, Mark knew the lawyer was right. He couldn't undo what he'd done, but he could take responsibility for it. As night fell and the station grew quieter, he found himself reflecting deeply. Images of the guard blinking furiously to clear the sand from his eyes haunted him. He thought about the tourists whose experiences had been disrupted because of his outburst. Most painfully, he imagined how his family would react when they heard the news. Would they be disappointed? Ashamed? For the first time since arriving in the country, Mark truly grasped the importance of respecting local customs and traditions. Travel guides always emphasized the need to adapt to new environments, but he had dismissed those warnings as unnecessary formalities. Now he realized how naive he'd been. Every culture had its own values, symbols, and rules, and ignoring them wasn't just rude. It could lead to dire consequences. By the time dawn broke, Mark had resolved to face whatever came next with honesty and humility. He didn't know whether apologizing would make a difference or if the court would show him mercy, but he vowed to try. Sitting there in the quiet solitude of the cell, he promised himself that if given another chance, he would never take his frustrations out on others or underestimate the weight of cultural respect ever again. The courtroom was unlike anything Mark had ever seen before. Its high ceilings, ornate wood paneling, and rows of neatly dressed spectators gave it an air of solemnity that made his stomach churn. As he sat at the defendant's table, flanked by his lawyer, he couldn't help but feel small and out of place. The room buzzed with quiet murmurs as people discussed the case, their eyes occasionally darting toward him with a mix of curiosity and judgment. Reporters scribbled notes in the back, ready to capture every detail for the evening news. When the judge entered, the room fell silent. Dressed in a flowing black robe, the judge carried an aura of authority that demanded respect. After a brief introduction, the prosecution began presenting its case. They highlighted the seriousness of Mark's actions, emphasizing how assaulting a royal guard wasn't just a personal offense. It was an affront to national pride. Photos of the incident were shown on a large screen, and video clips played on loop, capturing the exact moment Mark threw the sand. Each frame seemed to magnify his guilt, leaving no room for denial. The prosecutor argued that leniency would send the wrong message, especially in a country where the guards were revered as symbols of tradition and discipline. If we allow such behavior to go unpunished, they stated firmly, we risk undermining the very values our nation holds dear. The words hit Mark like a punch to the gut. He hadn't considered the broader implications of his actions until now. To him, it had been a split-second decision born out of frustration, but to everyone else, it represented something much bigger, a violation of trust and respect. When it was Mark's turn to speak, his lawyer encouraged him to address the court directly. Standing up, Mark felt his legs tremble beneath him. All eyes were on him, waiting to hear what he had to say. Taking a deep breath, he began haltingly, his voice barely above a whisper. I never meant to cause harm or disrespect anyone, he started, glancing briefly at the judge before lowering his gaze. I was angry and frustrated, and I let my emotions get the better of me. That doesn't excuse what I did. I know that now, and I'm deeply sorry. He went on to explain how little he'd understood about the cultural significance of the Royal Guards before coming to the country. Back home, I thought they were just part of the tourist experience. Something decorative, not real people with responsibilities and pride, he admitted. But being here has taught me how wrong I was. These guards represent centuries of history and tradition, and I disrespected that in the worst way possible. As Mark spoke, the tension in the room softened slightly. Some spectators nodded sympathetically, while others remained skeptical. When he finished, the judge studied him carefully, weighing his words against the evidence presented. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the verdict came, guilty of assault and public misconduct. However, there was a glimmer of hope. Recognizing Mark's remorse and willingness to take responsibility, the judge opted for a lighter sentence than expected. Instead of jail time, Mark was ordered to perform community service at a local museum dedicated to preserving the nation's history. He was also required to pay restitution for the affected guards' medical expenses and write a formal apology letter to be published in a national newspaper. While relieved, Mark knew this was far from over. He still had work to do to make amends. Walking out of the courtroom, Mark felt a strange mix of gratitude and determination. Gratitude because he'd been given a second chance, and determination because he wanted to prove that he'd learned from his mistakes. This wasn't just about clearing his name. It was about showing the world and himself that he could grow from this experience. Back in his temporary accommodation, a modest hostel far removed from the grandeur of the palace, Mark found himself staring at the blank screen of his laptop. The court's decision still lingered in his mind, heavy but not crushing. He had avoided jail time, yes, but the weight of accountability pressed down on him more than any bars ever could. Tonight, he was tasked with writing the apology letter ordered by the judge, a public acknowledgement of his wrongdoing that would be published for all to see. At first, Mark struggled to find the right words. How could he possibly convey the depth of his regret without sounding insincere or rehearsed? He opened a search engine and typed phrases like how to write an apology and examples of genuine remorse, scrolling through articles until one piece of advice stood out. Be honest. Speak from the heart. Closing the browser, he took a deep breath and began typing. Dear people of country, he wrote, pausing briefly before continuing. I want to start by saying I am truly sorry for my actions last week. What I did was thoughtless, disrespectful, and completely unacceptable. As the sentences flowed onto the page, so did his emotions. He described how his frustration and ignorance had blinded him to the significance of the royal guards, not just as symbols of tradition, but as real people who deserved respect. He admitted he hadn't understood their role in preserving the nation's heritage, and explained how this experience had opened his eyes to the importance of cultural awareness. I came here thinking only about myself, about what I wanted to see and do, he continued. But I failed to recognize that travel isn't just about taking photos or checking off landmarks. It's about learning, listening, and respecting the places we visit and the people who call them home. I let my anger take over, and in doing so, I hurt someone and disrespected your country. For that, I will always feel ashamed. As he wrapped up the letter, Mark promised to use this experience as a turning point. I hope my mistake can serve as a reminder to others about the importance of patience and humility when traveling. I plan to dedicate myself to understanding different cultures better and encouraging others to do the same. Thank you for allowing me the opportunity to make amends. When he finally finished, tears pricked at the corners of his eyes. Reading it back, he realized it wasn't perfect, but it was honest. And honesty, he reminded himself, was a start. The days that followed were filled with reflection. Mark reported to the local museum where he'd been assigned community service. At first, he dreaded the idea of scrubbing floors or organizing dusty artifacts, but the staff surprised him with kindness. They welcomed him warmly, explaining that his role would involve giving guided tours to school children, helping maintain exhibits, and assisting visitors. Each task forced him to confront his earlier arrogance and embrace humility. Slowly, he began to appreciate the beauty of the nation's history, the stories behind every painting, artifact, and uniform. One afternoon, while setting up a display about the royal guards, Mark met an elderly volunteer named Clara. She noticed his interest and struck up a conversation. You seem different from most tourists, she said with a knowing smile. Like you're actually paying attention now. Mark chuckled nervously, admitting he'd learned the hard way. Clara nodded knowingly, sharing stories about her own travels and mistakes she'd made along the way. Her words resonated deeply. We grow the most when we realize how much we don't know. By the end of his service, Mark felt transformed. His initial bitterness toward the crowded streets and chaotic crowds had faded, replaced by gratitude for the lessons he'd learned. He knew he couldn't undo what he'd done, but he could channel his regret into something positive. This wasn't just redemption, it was growth. Months after the incident, Mark returned home a changed man. The journey back was quiet, almost somber, as he replayed the events of his trip in his mind. He no longer saw himself as the carefree traveler who had set out to explore the world. Instead, he carried the weight of his mistakes and the lessons they taught him, like an invisible backpack. But this burden wasn't entirely negative. It reminded him of how far he'd come and the promise he'd made to himself, to never let frustration or ignorance overshadow respect and humility. Back in his hometown, life slowly returned to normal, or at least, it appeared that way on the surface. Friends and family greeted him with curiosity, eager to hear about his adventures. At first, Mark hesitated to share the full story. How could he explain what had happened without sounding like a fool? But eventually, he decided to be open about everything. The chaos, the anger, the sand, the arrest, and even the apology letter. To his surprise, people didn't judge him harshly. Instead, many admitted they might have reacted similarly under pressure, though perhaps not so drastically. We've all been there, one friend said kindly. The important thing is you learned from it. Encouraged by their support, Mark began sharing his experience more widely. He wrote a blog post titled, "What Throwing Sand Taught Me About Respect," detailing his missteps and the cultural awakening that followed. The article struck a chord with readers, sparking conversations about responsible tourism and the importance of understanding local customs. Comments poured in from travelers around the world, some confessing their own embarrassing moments abroad, and others thanking Mark for reminding them to approach new cultures with care. Inspired by the response, Mark took things a step further. He started visiting schools and community centers, giving talks about his experience and advocating for mindful travel. Armed with photos, stories, and heartfelt advice, he encouraged young people to embrace curiosity over entitlement when exploring unfamiliar places. "It's okay not to know everything," he told them during one presentation. "But it's not okay to act like your feelings are more important than someone else's dignity." His words resonated deeply, earning him invitations to speak at larger events and even collaborate with travel organizations promoting ethical tourism. In time, Mark became something of an advocate, a reluctant hero born out of failure. Though he never sought fame or recognition, he couldn't deny the sense of purpose his newfound role gave him. It wasn't just about making amends anymore. It was about using his experience to help others avoid similar pitfalls. Still, he kept reminders of his past close. A framed copy of his apology letter hung on his wall, serving as both a keepsake and a warning. Occasionally, he revisited the videos and articles that had documented the incident, cringing at his younger self but feeling grateful for the growth it sparked. The Royal Guards, once symbols of frustration, now represented resilience and discipline in his eyes. He often thought about the guard whose face he'd hit with sand, wondering if the man had moved on or still remembered the chaotic day. If given the chance, Mark hoped to meet him someday, not to justify his actions, but simply to say thank you. By the end of the year, Mark planned another trip, not to the same country, but to a completely different part of the world. This time, however, he approached it differently. He read extensively about its history, traditions, and social norms. He packed lighter, mentally and physically, leaving behind the impatience that had once fueled his temper. And most importantly, he carried with him the knowledge that every culture deserves reverence, no matter how foreign it may seem. As he boarded the plane, Mark felt a quiet confidence settle over him. He knew challenges lay ahead. Travel always came with its share of frustrations, but he also knew he was better equipped to handle them. Life, he realized, wasn't about avoiding mistakes. It was about learning from them. And sometimes, those lessons shaped us into exactly who we were meant to become.